Good afternoon, everybody. We are recording this. I have to say that up front. So if you're not supposed to be here for any reason, then angle your camera up so we can only see the top of your head or something, and you should be fine. Delighted to be able to welcome so many of you to our Speakers Corner event this month. There are a number of new faces on the call, so I do feel that I should introduce Innovate Ireland. My name's Charlie Tuxworth. I'm one of the co-founders. The idea for Innovate Ireland came from meeting up over coffee, where we shared lessons learned from delivering innovation, sometimes moaned about exec teams that didn't quite get it. In fact, we moaned about that quite a lot. And we also bounced around those all-important stupid questions that everybody has when it comes to innovation. The chats were useful, fun, strangely therapeutic, and we realised that while there's plenty of support across Ireland and Northern Ireland for startups and early stage companies, there was basically nowhere to turn to for advice for those who are learning, driving or delivering innovation in established organisations. So eventually this led to the creation of Innovate Ireland, and we are becoming the all-Ireland go-to community for practitioners, advocates and explorers of innovation. We're sharing great content, best practice and thought leadership, and we're now starting to represent our members at a national and international level. And we look to achieve all of this while still trying to maintain the openness, trust and enthusiasm we've got in those coffee shop meetings. We've got over 200 members from all parts of the island of Ireland. We cover a really broad range of business sectors. So that brings us back up to date and on to today's event. So when the term open source hit the software world, I think in around the late 90s, it presented a significant challenge to the conventional and traditional thinking of many enterprises, and it was met by reactions ranging from delight, confusion, suspicion, and probably even denial in some cases. But since then, it's become one of the driving forces behind the world's digital economy, and the methods and practices involved are, and probably should be, of interest to anyone involved in innovation. So to explore this further, I'm delighted to introduce you to our two fantastic speakers today. Many of you will know Clare Dillon, who's working with Moss Labs to support the university and government open source program offices. But I remember Clare from way back in her days as a Microsoft evangelist, promoting the latest and greatest development and collaboration tools. Danese Cooper's credentials in the area of open source are quite simply second to none, and that's no exaggeration in any way. Danese is the founder and chair of InnerSource Commons, itself a growing community of practitioners creating and sharing knowledge around open source best practice. Her previous roles include Senior Director and Head of Open Source Software at PayPal, CTO of Wikipedia, Senior Director of Open Source Strategies for Intel, and that's just to name three. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And as I hand over to Clare now, I just ask everybody if you can save up any questions until we've heard from both of the speakers, and then we'll open up Q&A basically until we run out of time, which will be just before 2. So Clare, over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and thanks for inviting us here today. And hello, everyone. As Charlie mentioned, my background is in Microsoft, and that's probably where I first came across open source. I kind of feel like I came with Microsoft on their road to Damascus moment around open source. I was there when Steve Ballmer almost, called it a cancer, and I was there at the end when they were all like getting on stage with big Microsoft Heart Linux logos, and so I came on the journey with Microsoft in that respect. But it's only in the last 3 years since I left Microsoft that I have become more involved with people in the open source community who have actually been working on open source code. And through my work with Moss Labs and indeed InnerSource Commons, I've met many more people who are focused on looking at even the business implications and benefits of using open source. So one of the reasons that I'm delighted to be here today is because, it dawned on me that maybe not enough people understand the latest trends in terms of the value that open source can bring to businesses. And really, that's what my bit of today is about. So I'll get straight into it. First of all, to say that when I think about open source, it's not just the open source code as a license I think about, but also the community practices around it. And I know that this is something that Denise will go into in a little bit more detail as to what that can mean. But it is important to call out that, you know, in many respects, open source is not just a noun in terms of open source code, but it's a verb in terms of how people, the ways in which people can build software. And it's an important distinction. It's not just a license that you would use. So first of all, I'm going to just go through some of the more, some business models that leverage open source, or how businesses are currently leveraging open source. Because in my experience, many people see this as maybe a narrow set of opportunities, but actually what's emerging is that there are more and more businesses exploring different ways in which they can leverage the growing open source community and the value that that brings. So looking from the top, the first thing that is most common when people think about open source and how it can actually benefit businesses is in terms of how it can accelerate your own development. So by using open source code, people speed up the development processes, basically because they don't have to build everything from scratch. But another way, and this is probably very familiar from something like Red Hat, it's how Red Hat came to the market and got their very incredible valuation when they were bought by IBM in recent years. But there's another way, which is actually providing enterprise support for open source projects. And that's a very common model for businesses who are thriving in this open source ecosystem. Another opportunity for businesses is when they take open source projects and customize it for the context of a business. And that can be a fruitful path for organizations. And I think one of the really interesting trends that I have seen when talking to some organizations who are in the open source ecosystem is this idea that you can actually be a services company in the open source world. But if you actually convince your end customers about the value of actually producing open source code as the output of custom development, you can actually have all your custom services engagements lead to an overarching product that perhaps all the future, current and past customers in your business can leverage. And so we are seeing some organizations who are able to marry services and product development in a way that perhaps they couldn't in the proprietary software world, where every custom project is owned by the end customer and not by you, and therefore is divorced from your own product development experiences. And so this is a really interesting collaboration, internal organization collaboration construct that is made possible by operating in the open source world. Another area is software as a service. And indeed, in my book, this is one of the reasons why open source as a commercial business model is becoming more and more, I think, relevant, is because these days it's not enough just to have the source code, but there's real value that can be provided by just running it, maintaining it, making sure it's got its uptime, providing that kind of support around it. So when organizations take an open source project and provide it as a SaaS service, that's a really viable business model in this day and age. And lastly, I'm going to use the term open core, but I'm going to put a cautionary note on this one. People in the open source community are using this in two ways. You could, for example, call open core organizations just organizations who are leveraging the benefits of open source in the context of their organization, very similar to what I've described in case number one. But there is a different definition that had been prevalent in the open source community of open core businesses, and that is the practice of opening a smaller part of your source code, but then charging for add-on features that might be enterprise features. And the reason why I'm putting a cautionary note on this is because that is a kind of a relatively dangerous path to go down, partially because they have people run into trouble in choosing to go that path, sometimes because the open source community just decide to implement your enterprise features anyway, but also because you're at risk of actually alienating the community that you build around your project by keeping some value from them. And so it's got this tension in the business that perhaps sometimes isn't worth it. So the reason why I'm outlining these is because I think that sometimes people for the most part, maybe think of Red Hat. I haven't even mentioned the organizations who are building tooling for the open source community, but there are so many ways that people are exploring about how to add value and leverage value in the open source ecosystem that is evolving. And so it's really interesting to look at some of these evolving models. I will mention that there's an organization called COS Media, or Commercial Open Source Media, and that group based on the West Coast are actually following open source companies, commercial open source companies, looking at the VC investment that's behind them, looking at their rate of progression. And what they're finding is that there is a big trend in funding open source companies that perhaps hadn't been there in the past, but also that companies who have open source at the core of their business are actually accelerating in the market, perhaps faster than closed proprietary, so of course, closed source organizations. And so this is a really interesting trend, and they've got lots of great data on the types of organizations that are there. So if you're interested, have a look at their site. But I will also talk about some of the strategic value that has been acknowledged to be able to be derived from open source, because I think that perhaps these are, some of these may be obvious to you, but some of these were new to me when I started thinking and learning about how organizations are leveraging open source today. The first one is the fact that open source, as I mentioned before, can dramatically accelerate your development. Now, it's well acknowledged that just by the fact that you can take these pre-built components and put them together, that would accelerate anyone's job of work, even if you didn't do it, just because you don't have to build it from scratch. But what's really interesting is that in recent times, reports have been emerging. There was one recently from McKinsey around developer velocity, which showed that it wasn't just the use of open source code that can accelerate R&D, but actually the idea of actually using open source methods and practices, even if you're not creating open source code, even if you're creating closed source code, and we call that InnerSource, but the use of open source methods and practices can actually speed up the practice and method of creating software. And that's because of the collaboration, because it breaks down silos, because it really makes real this idea that you could actually have cross-organizational innovation. And so that's a really interesting trend. The second thing is that collaboration just drives innovation, because if you have more people collaborating on a given problem, number one, it actually shares the cost across multiple organizations. But number two, it's diverse by design. So you get multiple people inputting into the process. And I've heard people say, but wouldn't that slow down the process? But actually, the open source community have derived methods and processes which allow people to prioritize input in a really efficient way. And in fact, they, in my book, are leaders in the area of remote working and enabling asynchronous remote working. So they have figured out how to do it. And by actually allowing collaboration to happen across organizations or across industries, that drives innovation, increases efficiencies, reduces the cost of maintenance in the future, and it really does drive the innovative process. The other way people are using open source is to disrupt the market. So there have been cases in the past where organizations have actually released open source code in order to be able to disrupt incumbents in the market. Because if you have a large player who is already established as a commercial offering, one way to disrupt their market position is to make source code available as open source and build a community around that in the open source community. And there have been a number of examples whereby technology has won in the market because people have taken on that approach and that strategic approach. One example that could be used is, for example, Kubernetes. Docker had been the market leader, but when Kubernetes was released in the open source community, gained huge traction very, very quickly and soon became the default or the more popular approach to using for DevOps and things like that. The other area that I think is important to mention is that open source methods and practices are much more common now in younger generations of developers. And so these younger generation, when they're used to actually collaborating in the open with agency, being able to create PRs and doing the job that needs to be done, scratching their own itch, as it were, when they get used to that, they really don't want to go into organizations that have closed source and you can't see what's being done and you have to get permission to even be able to look at other people's code and go into a queue for feature requests. These people want to be able to do what they need to do when they need to do it. And so a lot of organizations are using this open approach to developing software to both attract talent, be able to find them, and retain talent. By making a project or being involved in an open source project, you can actually become aware of potential talent that you might want to attract, and even see how good they are before you actually hire them, which is great as well. And the last thing I want to mention is transparency and trust, because I'm of the opinion that one of the key challenges for the whole technology industry is this idea that we can build it, but they don't necessarily come when you do, right? So there's a real gap between building technology and getting it used. And one of the challenges in crossing that particular chasm is the idea of trust in the technology that you build. And I really firmly believe that by opening source code, it really helps on that trust journey. I certainly know that in the context of the COVID tracker app that was built in Ireland, it was one of the primary reasons that the source code was initially made available to people, was so that privacy experts could examine it and thereby give it the stamp of approval, which would allow for the community at large to trust it. And I think that that transparency and trust is going to become more and more important as we move down a digital transformation route. And so open source plays a big part of that. And lastly, I'm just going to mention the fact that there's a huge amount of social and economic impact that is emerging from studies around open source. And indeed, there are, if you look at, for example, any national innovation strategy, for example, accelerating R&D, impact on enterprise, education, social and economic development, transfer of knowledge and collaboration, all of these things open source can help with, and particularly for things in global collaboration, where it removes a whole layer of bureaucracy if everyone is collaborating in one global open source project. And you even have organizations like the UN now looking to open source to be ways in which they can accelerate the impact of their work in technology spheres to get it to more countries and get more countries collaborating more easily on real projects that will change the world. I'll also briefly mention the Open Forum Europe report, which is not out yet, but they did release some preliminary results. And they talked an awful lot about the potential impact on GDP, the potential impact on the number of startups, and all of these things can be correlated to a growth in open source contributions. So they would estimate that there is, I think, about $100 billion, or euros, should I say, 100 billion euros in the EU GDP in the future could be added per year if we increased the number of contributions in open source by just 10%, which is huge. And they have some data to back that up in terms of economic studies. So, thinking about that, thinking about all the trends in terms of more startups being created, there's a huge amount of potential economic impact that could be derived from actually building code by default in the open. So that's my summary of why I think there's a huge amount of strategic value in looking at open source. I will say that it's not necessarily, I suppose, there are some potential challenges in moving to an open source model. I would also say that some of those are perceived challenges that may not actually have reality and basis, based in reality, but some of them are real challenges. And one of those is, for example, the talent availability of people who are experienced in this area. And that's one of the reasons why I think Ireland needs to look at this, because we have a huge opportunity that's there at the moment where we could actually help get more people experienced in working in the open, working with open source methods and practices. And that would allow us to better represent Ireland on the international stage. But I will now hand over to Denise Cooper, who is kindly going to share her wealth of experience with us. Charlie gave a great introduction to her background there before, but I will hand over to Denise because she is going to cover a little bit more about what those open methods and practices are, but also some of the myths surrounding open source, which I'm really looking forward to hearing from. So I will stop sharing now. If I can stop sharing now. And I will ask Denise if you would like to take over the screen and take over the presentation. I will hand over to you. Oh, and you're mute.
I hate it when that happens. Thank you very much, Claire, and I'm really happy to be here this morning. It's pretty early for me because I happen to be in America right now, so excuse my hair. But I have been very excited since I moved to Ireland to try to help get to a place where Ireland has a better stance on open source for Ireland. You know, I'm big on trying to help wherever I go, but I did spend 22 years helping to build this movement, and I think it's a shame that that Ireland's not yet leveraging this amazing source of wealth, especially since the European Union is pushing so hard for member states to, you know, get this now. And you have, you know, lucky you, I live here and I'm interested in seeing that happen. The COVID tracing app that Claire referenced earlier, the company that I work for built that app, and I was involved in the open sourcing of it. And many Irish people don't realize, she talked about how the privacy experts were able to see the code and that made them advocates for us. And that's true, that happened. But then we actually opened it. And so one of the things I'm going to teach you today is the difference between the noun open source and the verb open source, because you have to do both things to get all the benefits we've been talking about. And in actually open sourcing it, we gained incredible reach. It's actually the most used full-featured contact app in the world, believe it or not, written in Ireland. And that's partly because we made it available to people via open source, and there are countries like New Zealand that picked it up and used it that we didn't help them at all, other than conversations between our public health and their public health. All right, enough of that. Let's get on to the slides. I will share. Okay. So, all right, so what I wanted to talk about was open source as a verb and the idea that it's not enough to treat it as a noun. So first of all, we didn't really believe that open source was going to triumph when we started. It was just a hobby for most of us. And the reason that we were doing it was because we were very unhappy with the way some proprietary software was being managed. As users, we were unhappy with quality and with the fact that we were forced to upgrade our version and pay money to the company again just to open documents from previous versions. There were lots of things we didn't like. So we started into this thing, and initially there was a lot of attention given to licensing. But open source is not just a license. In fact, the license is the very beginning of the process. And unfortunately, a lot of people think that just putting that license on code and making it visible is open source. And people will say, well, I open sourced that. And when we go look at it, it's not in fact open sourced, it's just visible code. It has a license that allows you to fork it if you want to, but almost all the benefits of open source come after that fact, from building a community of other people that are going to use the code. So the principles of open source are that that you play to enlighten self-interest, that you mentor for better contributions, and that you lower barriers to inclusion so that all the boats rise, so that you get everything you need, right? And for those of you in Ireland, I have a nice picture of hurling for this one. Enlightened self-interest is something that most people who don't know very much about open source don't even have an idea is part of it. People tend to think that we were altruistic because we started out as hobbyists. I want to make it clear, the open source projects that actually get somewhere only get there because of enlightened self-interest, because the people that are participating are getting something out of that transaction that they couldn't get by just watching somebody else do it. They're getting their feature expressed faster. They're getting a whole new set of things that they could that weren't there before, like it's suddenly supporting their architecture because they did the work to make that happen, and that opens markets. They're doing it because they're individual developers who want a resume of real code that they've actually made. This makes it very easy to know who you're hiring. If they're already in open source, you can go look at the work that they've done when you weren't looking at them. So there's lots of reasons why people do this enlightened self-interest thing, but we are not angels. We are not altruists to the core. We're making money on this, and your average open source developer makes about a third more than a regular developer. And the reason that we get to do that is because our code is inspectable. We're willing to put our code up for public inspection. Therefore, we have learned how to be very, very precise in the quality of our code. All right, so mentorship is the second principle that I mentioned. You mentor not because it's easy, not because it's fun, but because it gets you better quality of contribution. And that quality of contribution is a lot of the benefit of open source. A lot was made initially of the many eyes make small work, and that's true. If you have enough people looking at your bugs, somebody's going to see the thing you didn't see, and you'll get it fixed much more quickly. But the mentorship piece is about growing your community. So it's not enough to throw the code over the wall. You have to actually stick around and have conversations with the contributors that you attract to help them get to contribution faster. And by doing that, you make them more effective, but it becomes a snowball, and the effectiveness of your community grows as the size of your community grows if you make mentorship the baseline. And then once you've created this rich, fertile user and enthusiast base by making any of the folks who come to work on your software look good, they see themselves represented in your community. They see how they're going to fit in, and then they show up at the party with all their friends. So you want to be inclusive, not in the current Me Too movement or anti-Me Too movement sense, but just in the basic, we want to welcome all contributors because we're trying to lift this whole boat, and we can't do it with just ourselves. And all of these things fly in the face of the way software was made and vended for, a good 30 years before open source. That was very, very effective at creating deep pockets of monetization, but it was at the expense of both the quality of the software and the happiness of the users, and in many cases also the developers that were working on it. So now I'm going to tell you about a little industry secret. There's something called InnerSource that has been gaining momentum in the last 6 years. I am a biased participant in this because I founded something called the InnerSource Commons, but I didn't coin the term. I've known about InnerSource since 2000 when Tim O'Reilly, who's a famous publisher for technical books and also was born in Killarney, by the way, when he coined this term, he meant use open source methods inside your company because it's a better way to engineer. But unfortunately, at the time, open source hadn't won in the marketplace yet, and so it was pretty easy for people to push back on it. As soon as we got to that big open source win, I started talking about InnerSource because I run into companies all the time, including the one I was working for at that moment, who don't know how to collaborate inside their organizations. They're still asking people to make feature requests and wait around for somebody who is more expert in that code base to write the request for that, fulfill the request. That is a very, very lossy way of doing software engineering. It doesn't grow your engineers, and it doesn't, and it creates bottlenecks and silos and lots of other problems. So I started pushing InnerSource as a pathway to open source and an optimal engineering method. Now, if you were seeing my slides now, which I hope you are by now, you would see a picture of all the companies that are using it. These are just the ones that we are allowed to talk about. For each of these, there are 10 or 12 that we're talking to that aren't comfortable with us saying it yet. So I'm going to read them to you in case you're not seeing this. This is Morgan Stanley, Deutsche Bank, Royal Bank of Canada, so the banking industry likes it, Wipro, Tencent, Microsoft, believe it or not, has put a lot of energy into making this method inside their company work because of what they saw when they used open source developers for Azure. Capital One, Bank of America, American Airlines, Ericsson, Europace, Lloyd's, Philips, Comcast, BBC, Disney, IBM, of course PayPal, because I dragged them to it, but they were very early. Daimler, Redmonk, which is an advocacy firm. GitHub itself uses it. Nokia Labs, Bosch, Bloomberg, Cognizant, Freddie Mac, T-Mobile, Accenture. I mean, it's everybody. Red Hat is starting to talk about it quite a bit. And what that tells you is this is an idea whose time has come. Now, some of these people are using InnerSource to fix what's broken in their engineering organization. But a lot of them are using it to help them understand how to do proper open source. That's why Comcast uses it. That's why Microsoft is interested in it, because the understanding of open source opened their eyes to how this is a better method. So how do you get involved with InnerSource? And this is the last time I'll talk about that. There is a website we created called InnerSourceCommons.org. And if you go there, you will find a vibrant community of contributors that believe this is the future of engineering and are working to build things you need, like training and books and academic papers. And all of those things already exist there for free use, completely unencumbered. There are several working groups that are working on increasing things like identifying patterns and then specifying them so other people can use them, both anti-patterns and patterns that are beneficial. So if you go there to InnerSourceCommons.org, please introduce yourself. Promise we'll be nice to you. If you happen to work in the fintech world, there's also a special interest group at an organization called Finos, that's Finos, which is helping fintech companies understand open source. And when they met us, they were like, oh my God, can you come over here? And now when we have meetings, they consistently are better attended than anything else that Finos does. So they really like us. All right, so back to open source. This is your myth section. There are a lot of myths about open source out there. That's because in the early days, some very deep pocket companies figured out that it was going to hurt their business model. And so they organized to kill it with messaging. Happily, they didn't organize to kill it with bad acting, because that might have worked. But the messaging thing has only left a lot of people very confused. And we run into this a lot when we talk to people in Ireland in particular. So I'm going to, really lean on these. So first of all, you were made to think this by a competing company. And a lot of the information that you were given is actually not true. So first of all, the myth that you can't find support, and because you need a single throat to choke when you buy something, it's not appropriate for you. It's not actually true. Red Hat, you might know, last year sold itself to IBM for billions of dollars. It was a record sale. Their entire business model is support. And they will write you a support contract for pretty much anything that they sell. But IBM has for many years written support contracts against any open source project, whether or not they have anything to do with it. They'll train themselves up on it and they will help you. Now, it can be difficult to find individual practitioners, and that is why Ireland needs to double down on teaching this in schools. Because if more Irish people were involved in open source, the indigenous available talent would be much better, and that would help a lot with the problem of finding, suitable practitioners. Another myth is people think it's the unwashed masses that built this. There can't be very good engineers if they're giving away their work. Well, in fact, there have been many studies that show that we're the best engineers in the world. And I say that with no irony, because we're willing to make our work public, which a point I made earlier. Bill Joy, when I worked for Sun, Bill Joy, famous scientist, basically ported Unix for the first time to the PDP in the 80s. He said, the fact is, Sun cannot hire all of the best people. They can only hire part of the best people. If we can figure out a way to work with all of the best people to the ends that we want to reach, then we're winning. And open source is the way to do that, right? Now, the truth is, when I worked at Sun, was not super happy that we were heading for true open source, because he was also prey to the unwashed masses, quote. And when I asked around about why he was so worried about the quality of the code, somebody that had known him a long time rolled his eyes and said, Bill rewrites everything. Nobody's a good enough engineer for Bill. So, if you're trying to hold yourself to that standard, you got bigger problems. Okay, another big myth, that the security is poor. This really generally comes from like the World War II era concern about loose lips sinking ships. But we haven't had secrecy for a long time, and betting your security on secrecy is, believe it or not, a risky thing to do. Most nasty security problems are created statistically by disgruntled employees. right? What works is letting all of the security community see your code because they can find issues very quickly. And for the entire history of open source, there's been a practice of addressing individual issues in that way. What happens is people report the issues to a security team who immediately goes to work on the problem, but does not publicize the existence of that problem until they have a patch. And statistically, that process is much more efficient than the commercial process of addressing bugs, because there's no issue of we've capitalized this work and we don't want to touch it again until we've made all the money we were expecting to make out of it, which is a real consideration for old-fashioned proprietary companies. But in open source, security is the most important thing. And Whitfield Diffie, who got a Turing Award for co-inventing Diffie-Hellman encryption, which is also called RSA encryption, was the main security guy at Sun. And I asked him about this myth, and he said, first of all, there's no statistical magic bullet that says this is obviously better than this. These two approaches to security, open versus proprietary. But if you look at the statistics about how much faster security issues are addressed in open source, very efficiently, very effectively, it's the clear winner. And so there you go, from the horse's mouth. Another one is that you can't make money on it because the IP is open and your ROI goes down. So the problem with this one is a myth about the patent system or patent system. And people in the audience who make their living dealing with patents are not going to love hearing this. But the patent system is pretty broken for software. It was designed for physical inventions. Right now, there are way too many bad patents getting through. So many, in fact, that only about a third of business method patents are actually upheld at all in court. And of course, not all of them go to court. So that's telling you a tiny percentage of them are being upheld. And they're not really legal in Europe yet. So most patents that are written these days are business method patents because original research, original invention is fairly rare right now. The likelihood that you're going to make money on your patent is vanishingly small. And if you get into trouble with your patent, you get into litigation, the most likely redress is mutual disclosure. If you have one patent and the other side has 1,000, like IBM has 1,000 to 1 against all other IP holders, they're going to disclose something that doesn't cost them very much, and you're going to have to disclose the family jewels. This is not a system that works well for us. It doesn't work at the pace of change in software. So it's a red herring to believe this. And most of the people I hear that talk about this are lawyers who make their money off of filing patents. Very few lawyers make money off of enforcing patents because it's just not happening very often. All right. Proprietary partners won't like it is another myth that we hear. And the truth is that most tech companies now have OSPOs. Most big companies have already had to deal with open source, and we're down to the middle companies. Now, we know from the report that Claire talked about earlier that in Europe, most open source is happening at the small company level. So, when I hear that procurement says no to open source because they think it's going to be too much trouble, what that tells me is there's a problem with procurement. And let me tell you about India. I spent 10 years going to India every quarter to talk about open source and evangelize it. I've been everywhere you could go in India. Because it's a developing nation country, it was obvious to them that this was going to be a better deal. But they would always stop and say, we can't do this because Microsoft pays for our post-secondary education and they will punish us if we go against them. But that was before Satya Nadella. Since Ballmer has been gone, and Claire told you she watched this transformation, all of a sudden Microsoft is a pretty good open source customer. They're a pretty good practitioner. And that transformation allowed India to go from 0 to 60 in the open source world. All of a sudden, they've got open source coming out their ears. They've got laws that says public money must be expressed in public code. If you're using it to write code, you have to open source that code. They have, it's a big country, but they're all in on open source, and it's really showing in forward progress they're making in things like their space race. So another myth is that it's uncontrolled and chaotic, but the truth is most open source projects have very well-defined decision-making processes. And it's not encumbered by the big reveal, which is the thing that Apple still persists in doing, but it's very expensive to hold back on what you're working on until the last minute, because you might not be creating the right thing. What makes sense today is a stepped program of introducing new things, and the open source method fits perfectly into that. Then there's licensing is confusing, and I have a 5-minute license primer that I'd be happy to come back and do. In fact, we could do a whole day on legal issues if you want, because I ran the open source initiative for 10 years. So although I'm not a lawyer, I have the dubious distinction of having written more licenses that were accepted as open source than any other alive human, and it's a weird skill. So what I can tell you is open source licensing is actually pretty straightforward. And especially now that so much software is delivered via SaaS, the considerations are really straightforward as well. And then the last one, and the saddest one to me, is the belief that you don't have time to create community, that it's going to be too hard, and the velocity imperative of creating software quickly gets in the way of creating community. And the reason that makes me the most sad is that's where a lot of the benefits of open source actually come from, that community. It helps you find new employees. It helps you build, you can actually push the market in a direction you want to go. That's what the COVID Green app basically did. Now, we didn't write it for that reason, but we did write it to be data safe. It's one of the best instances of contact tracing because it is so carefully written for data safety. And so all those other people that are picking it up are doing that partly because it is written so carefully. And that increases Ireland's reputation as a tech community, frankly. But it also empowers people to get more people to use the contact tracing app in other parts of the world. So community is everything. And it's not as hard as you think, but it does take some time. So the belief that open source is good because of the lower cost of acquisition is true, but the end cost is in creating this community, but you get stuff back for it. Enlightened self-interest works for the companies as well as the individual practitioners. All right, that's the end of my talk. And I am more than happy to help with questions, and apologize again that we didn't get to use the slides because it looks like we didn't. I apologize.
No. Sorry, no, I wasn't able to get the email through. So
Charlie, I will make sure you get them. I'll try to figure out what just happened if you didn't get them yet.
Okay.
So you can distribute them to these people. That's fine with me.
Okay, that'd be fantastic, Denise and Claire. I mean, that was really enlightening. I mean, I love this model. I love the idea, probably because of my tech background and tech biases that I have, but I kind of love to make that jump between kind of the software world and the business world, and kind of learn from it. If people have questions, if you want to sort of start showing some hands in the chat, we've only got about 10 minutes. But in the meantime, I have a question. This is supposed chair's privilege. There's a lot going on in open source. I mean, it is on the face of it quite a complicated area. Is there an easy way in? If you have an organization that kind of likes the idea but doesn't know where to get started, yes, what can they do as the first step?
They can look at InnerSource.
Okay.
They can run a little experiment for 10 weeks inside their organization and learn everything they need to know about what the problems will be, what the successes will be. It's amazing how clarifying it is. And that's why so many fintech people are looking at it now, because they have to play in open source. They know they have to, because Stripe is eating their lunch. How do they get there, right?
Okay, that's great. So starting on a process improvement type sort of project, so something small, self-contained, that I suppose rather than trying to start developing new products.
Well, you don't have to fix your whole company to make this work. The other way to do it is do it at the edge. Start a project and anoint a few engineers to work on it. It's easy enough to find consultants that will help you make all the right moves, and that's the cheapest line of defense, frankly, that rather than trying to figure it out yourself. But if you have somebody that is already in your company that knows how to do it, they can advise you as well. But that is the harder way to get there.
Okay.
It's probably also worth mentioning that a lot of people are reporting that when they're embarking on something new that might be a shared service, like something like a CI/CD pipeline or something like a DevOps, that can be a really good opportunity to try collaborating in that open way internally, a safe space, but it also actually gives you a much better return on that investment before you go open source.
Okay, thank you. Carmel, you have a question? You have it first with a hand up.
Yeah, and apologies, I came in late, and Denise, you may have covered some of the things that I'm going to say, and if that's the case, just tell me to shut up.
No, it's all good. That's what
and this is coming from the angle of like we're local government and consuming of looking for solutions. But someone just to raise some of the issues that we would have come across. And the first question I have a few questions. The first one is when you talk about open source, are you talking about free?
So there was an early problem with this movement because the first name for this was free software. And the word free, unfortunately, in English means two things. It means free as in liberty and also free as in no cost. It is true that you can generally acquire from open source without paying any money, but there is a cost. There always has been. You have to give back. You guys who live in farming counties, you know that a lot of places have common areas that were originally for allowing people in a township to, mutually graze their animals, right? Well, if you let the animals graze and nobody ever reseeds the green or waters, you're going to run out of grass, right? The tragedy of the commons is a pretty clear economic reality. So you have to figure out how you're going to give back. Now, I would suggest that in Ireland for municipal governments, the give back is start a training program to create some open source developers so that this kind of work continues. But there are a lot of companies that are open source based that offer services they charge for. So it's not really the software they're charging for, it's the service that you get.
Okay, and just one of the other points is, I suppose a lot of the cost for us is you have the open source, you have the product, but then you have a third party then that you need someone to provide a service level agreement and to give the support on the product. We can't just lift an open source product and implement it ourselves without the service level. And some difficulties that we have come across, I don't know if you'd be familiar with the likes of Sugar CRM.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of local authorities, and this was a really bad experience for the sector where they jumped on this bandwagon. It's open source, it's free community version. And then we ran into issues lately with GDPR, and everybody that had the free version has now been hit with huge bills to move to an enterprise version.
Right.
And the rest of us that stuck with Microsoft and Proprietary are sitting back going, told you that open source was bad.
Okay, so
there's a recovery needed now. Yeah.
Sugar CRM is an example of an open core company in the bad sense of that word. They've got that free version out there, but it doesn't have all the features you need, and they know that. They plan to sell you those features, right? And that's not a good thing. That's not a good model. But also, I need to, everybody that's listening, I'm going to say it one more time. Using open source is not free. You guys are Irish. You know that that there's a thing that looks too good is probably not too good, right? You're going to pay something, and it's probably going to be support dollars. So when you're evaluating, you have to look at the total cost of ownership of open source versus the other thing, whatever the other thing is. And if you don't look at it that way, you're not being very smart about it. But one of the things that organizations like this or the Irish government could do is pre-qualify certain pieces of software. And even it's possible, since we have all these tech companies that are tenants, it is possible to build special agreements into some of those arrangements so that some things are just available to Irish counties. That's quite possible. There's lots of places that have done that. So it's a different way of thinking about it. If you're stuck thinking, I'm going to go buy this off the shelf and I'm going to absolve myself of any responsibility for it because they built it and they're going to service it for me, then what you're going to get is Microsoft servicing you on their terms, which means if the bug that's bothering you doesn't bother them particularly, and you're a small market, and we are a small market to them, it may be a while before they get around to fixing it, because it's not in their economic interest to fix it. But if Sugar CRM was a real open source project, and actually if you'd use Civi CRM, you would be there now, but how do you know that, right? Yeah. That's a different problem. That's why I'm saying it would be useful for the government to look at and pre-qualify some packages, right? But if you were using Civi CRM, all that GDPR stuff is already there. It's just there. So selecting carefully is important. It just is. And the Sugar CRM guys are very confused. We worked with them a long time to try to get them to change the way that they talk about what they do. And what can I tell you? You know, they're not, I would not have chosen them. So.
One final thing, if I'm allowed.
Thank you. Sorry, Carmel, go. If we let someone else in, because we've literally got 4 minutes left.
If you send me an email at denise@nearform.com, I'm happy to try to answer what else. Okay.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, I'm conscious that Claire's in back-to-back meetings till 8 o'clock tonight, so we're going to have to cut it too. And yourself, Denise. Owen, is it a quick one?
Yeah, for a start, well done, Claire and Denise. That's brilliant, very educational, and I think we can use that and how Ireland small, medium enterprises, public service can engage with open source. Amazing learning. That's something we can have a little chat about afterwards. In terms of a question, actually addressed much of it for me because I was going to cover some of the same ground as Carmel. But the word agile, now it's not for during today, we don't have time, but you didn't really use it. But the interplay between open source and agile is fascinating. Is it possible?
Actually, InnerSource and Agile also play very nicely together.
Yeah.
The only thing that I don't like about the advice you get from Agile, and it's not Agile itself, it's actually the
brands.
Yeah, there's an advice that says you need to co-locate people in order to get the maximum agile, but open source has been getting maximum agile with no co-location forever. And I'm starting to see conversations in Ireland. People have pulled me into conversations about promoting remote work as a real plan for future Irish companies because of Nearform. I work for Nearform. Part of the reason that I said yes to him, to Cian, was his vision of how to build a modern company, which is exactly built on the open source model. And, you know, look how far they came from Tremor, right? So it is possible that movement will really increase indigenous tech in Ireland, which I would love to see. You know, if Facebook had been invented in Ireland and somehow those people had been convinced not to move to New York or London, there would be no problem with the Celtic tiger because you'd have fault tolerance. So what we need is better indigenous tech, but the way to get there is through an understanding of modern methods.
The only other thing I'd say on that is, guys, the chat today is brilliant. The sharing, the linking, also a whole lot of thanks in there for Claire and Denise. But the chat has some great links. Have a look, everybody, before we sign off.
Yeah, and thank you guys for picking that up. And I do look for my slides. I promise I'll send them out to you today, and they'll have all the words I said, or some version of them.
That's great, thank you. Claire's comments, if it's okay, I'll post those into the LinkedIn event so that people can get them afterwards. We do need to wrap up, so I just want to say thank you, massive thank you to Denise and Claire for sharing your insights on this. It has been absolutely excellent. So we'll share Claire's comments. It's fantastic to hear of this confirmation of the importance of community, as that's what we're trying to build with Innovate Ireland. And if there's anything we can do to support your initiatives, then please let myself or Owen know, and we'll help to spread the message for you. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Denise. We'll let you go and get some breakfast, Denise.
Thank you.
And we'll see you hopefully. We'll hopefully see you again soon. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great weekend.
Bye. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.